The Path to Salvation. Part 2, Chapter 6, -2. 7. Labor over yourself without relaxing. So labor over yourself, and you will more and more be able to cast off your blindness, insensitivity, and indolence. But labor and labor without relaxing. There is deceit in a sinful soul, which tries all it can to disincline itself from the work of salvation. Come, take hold and carry it. It will not cross you. It simply does not want to do any work. No one can be master over your inner life besides you yourself. Enter there and break yourself, startle, instruct, carry on the work with yourself before the face of God, persuade and convince yourself. This is why we say that in the matter of conversion, reasoning with oneself is the only way in. If you yourself do not reason and think it out, who will do it for you? That is why, as is said to you, think about it, imagine it, delve into it. What a great blessing it is for the sinner if his depravity has not yet been able to completely stifle all the light of the knowledge of truth in him. Say his morals are corrupted, his feelings are unclean. But if a healthy understanding still lingers in the soul, there is still something to work with for the one who has begun to think about his salvation. When even that is no longer there, when even the mind has become depraved, he will either fall into doubts, having lost his conviction, or he will accept an entirely twisted teaching. Then there is nothing left for the man to use on himself. Then he must admit that he is unwholesome from head to toe. Incidentally, few go that far. As for those who do go that far, if there is any hope for their conversion, it occurs through the extraordinary and stunning actions of God's grace. Most sinners do not lose their faith, or healthy images, according to the apostle, their rationality, but only become morally corrupted. For these it is enough to be cleansed by forgetting their darkened understanding, and strengthening their conviction weakened by inattention and carelessness toward everything that is good. Sit and see for yourself what you should believe, how you should live, and in what you should trust, according to the symbol of faith and the Lord's commandments. If you have trouble, look at the catechesis. If you cannot do this either, talk with someone, especially with your spiritual father. When you do this, the truth reigning within you will arise victorious, and it will begin with authority to thrust out the unrighteous deeds, dispositions, and feelings that had taken you over. Then it will be easy to reason with yourself, expose your blindness, shatter your insensitivity, and cast out your indolence. 8. Reasoning with yourself about salvation. When so many subjects arise about which you need to reason with yourself, you must not think that only the educated can do it. Anyone can reason with himself about salvation, even children. This is not the same as academic reasoning. Every truth that comes to mind will immediately inspire the thing it requires. Just be conscientious and renew a sincere desire for good in yourself, with the readiness to follow the dictates of truth. But all of your self-instruction should be conducted in a way that will fit the aim, to act upon the soul and awaken. To this end, 1. When you reason with yourself, do not intellectualize, posing various questions, but having clarified a subject to yourself, take it to heart from the perspective that you feel will be the most impressive, and contemplate it thus. 2. Do not run quickly from one thought to another. This will sooner scatter your thoughts than gather them and influence the soul. The sun would not warm even one creature on earth if it were to run across it instantly. May the measure of reasoning about one thing or another be sympathy. Bring every thought into feeling, and do not let it go until it penetrates the heart. 3. If possible, do not leave a thought naked in a reasoned form, as it were, but robe it in some sort of image, and then carry it into the head as a constant reminder. It is even better if you can concentrate several striking images into one. Thus St. Theophan, in order to impress into the mind of the sinner the thought about the danger of his condition, says, "The sword of truth is above you, beneath you is hell ready to slay you, before you is death, behind you is a multitude of your sins. To the right and to the left of you is a crowd of vicious enemies. Can you possibly be indolent?" This image is easier to remember and keep in mind, and has a more powerful and impressive influence. Note: when doing all this, it is never superfluous to have soul-profiting reading at hand. All the subjects that you must study are clearly and powerfully revealed in them. Invaluable to this study among the writings of St. Theophan of Zadansk are the articles about sin, about blindness, about forgiveness to the unrepentant, and cell letters, private letters of instruction. To aid this self-instruction is an anthology of patristic writings entitled "Arise, You That Sleep." 4. Fall to the ground and make prostrations, many, many, and beat your breast. Do not leave praying as long as the prayer is moving. When prayer cools, again begin to contemplate, and go from this again to prayer. 5. For prayer, just as for contemplation, make short cries and repeat them often. Have mercy on thy creation, O Master. O God, be merciful to me, a sinner. O Lord, save me. O Lord, hasten to my aid. Bring to mind the inspiring church hymns and sing them. Behold, the bridegroom cometh at midnight. When I think of the many evil things I have done, I, a wretched one, I tremble at the fearful day of judgment. O my soul, why art thou sleeping? And other such hymns. 9. God's grace chooses well-known means. Thus force yourself, beat unceasingly at the door of the merciful God. What are we searching for by our labors? The grace of God that awakens. The grace of God is accustomed, in order to have an effect upon us, to choose well-known means, as was stated in the description of extraordinary actions of grace. Thus apply these means to yourself, and proceed under their sign and influence. Perhaps some ray of grace will fall on you, just as it has fallen on other sinners like you. 1. God's grace has chosen the churches of God and church rubrics for his activity. You should go to church, and patiently, attentively, and reverently listen to the services. For the church and its structures, the order of services, the singing and reading, all of this can have an effect. It is not surprising that though you enter the church idly, you will leave it having conceived the spirit of salvation. 2. Grace has worked through the Word of God. You too should take it and read it. Perhaps you will come across a section that will strike you as one did Blessed Augustine when he opened the New Testament. Note: let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting or drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying. But put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts therein. Romans 13:13-14. This verse provided a turning point in St. Augustine's life when he was finally converted. 3. The hearts of other sinners have been softened by discussions with pious people. You, too, go and have a discussion. If you hear word after word of discussion, will not one word strike you that will be unto the separation of soul and spirit, according to the thoughts of the heart? Perhaps a living word, warmed with love, will penetrate deep into your heart and shatter the stronghold of sin residing therein. 4. The prayers of the poor are powerful. You too, go and multiply your alms. Wipe the tears of the unfortunate. Shelter, if you can, the destitute. The prayerful moans of the impoverished reach heaven and pass through the heaven of heavens. Will not these prayers bring the angelic guide to you, as they did for Cornelius the centurion? Working these and other similar works, you will come into contact with the vessels and bearers of grace. Perhaps its enlivening dew will descend also upon you from somewhere and give life to the frozen seedlings of spiritual life. 10. Awaiting God's visitation. Thus the thought has come to correct your life and morality. Having cast off procrastination, humble and lighten your flesh with physical ascetic struggle. Remove yourself from cares and distractions by ceasing your usual business and by solitude, and then, concentrating your attention on various salvific thoughts, force yourself to cast out all blindness, insensitivity, and indolence by reasoning with yourself, or discussing with yourself, alternating this with prayer and placing yourself under the influence of such occasions as divine grace has chosen to act upon the souls of sinners. Labor, force yourself, search and you will find, knock and it will be opened to you. Do not relax and do not despair. But all the while remember that these labors only comprise the experience of our struggle to attract grace. They are not the grace itself, which we do not yet have. We have not yet acquired the main thing, grace-filled awakening. It is very noticeable that whether we reason, pray, or do some other thing, we squeeze something somewhat foreign into our hearts from without. Sometimes it happens that according to the intensity of our struggle, a certain pressure from these labors bear down to an established depth of heart, but the heart disgorges itself because a sort of elasticity against something foreign and unfamiliar to that heart. It is similar to the way a stick inserted vertically into water is expelled upward. Right after this, a coldness and turgidness begins in the soul, a clear indication that there never was any grace-filled influence, only our labor and exertion. Therefore do not content yourself with your efforts alone, as though they were what you were supposed to seek. This is a dangerous mistake. It is equally dangerous to think that there is a reward due for these labors, and grace should be automatically sent down to you. Absolutely not. This only prepares you to receive it, but the gift itself is entirely dependent upon the giver. Thus, making assiduous use of all the prescribed methods, the seeker should go on, awaiting God's visitation, which, by the way, does not come with discernment, but when it comes no one will know from whence it came. When this grace-filled awakening arrives, only then will real inner changes of life and morals begin. Without this you cannot expect any progress, only unsuccessful attempts. Witness to this is Blessed Augustine, who toiled and suffered long with himself, but only conquered himself when grace came and touched him. Labor in expectancy and the hope of faith. Grace will come and arrange everything. 11. What is grace-filled awakening? It is natural to ask, what is grace-filled awakening? Into what state does it put the sinner, and how does the state differ from other similar states? It is necessary to know the characteristic traits of awakening in order not to let it go by fruitlessly, so that you might not accept some natural state in its place. The state of the soul awakened by grace can be discerned by comparing it to the opposite state of a soul lost in the sleep of sin. The feeling of dependence on God returns. Sin separates a man from God. A person who has left God for sin does not perceive his dependence on God, lives as he pleases, as though he is not God's and God is not his. He is like a self-willed slave who is running from his master. Now his barrier is broken. The feeling of dependence on God returns. The person clearly realizes his total subservience to God and his absolute responsibility to him. Before, heaven for him was just a heavy copper lid stretched over his head. But now some rays of light pass through this dark veil, showing him God the Master and Judge. Within him is powerfully awakened the perception of the divinity in all his perfection, and the divinity irresistibly inhabits the soul, filling it entirely. This is the foundation and potentiality for the future spiritual life. One sees all his ugliness within. Sin first enveloped man in blindness, insensitivity, and indolence. At the moment of grace's influence, this three-layered, crystallized millstone falls from his fettered soul. The person now sees, well, all his ugliness within, and not only sees it, but also feels it. He also realizes the danger of his condition, begins to be ashamed of himself, and takes care for his fate. Not only does shame fall into the soul, but with the feeling of responsibility for oneself before God, fear, agony, and disappointment begin to powerfully attack his heart. His conscience gnaws at him. One feels a certain sweetness in godly life. Now he feels a certain sweetness in godly life, sensing all the futility of a sinful life and nursing a revulsion for it. As for a sea of evil, he also has a presentiment that joy and consolation are hidden in the realm of goodness, which is now being revealed to his spiritual eye. It comes into his view like the promised land, as a most blessed haven from all disquiet. This presentiment in a sinful soul is ultimately a manifestation that God himself cannot produce. It is God's blessing and is subject to his authority. Thinking about it is not the same as feeling it. God himself leads man's spirit into his treasure house and allows him to taste its blessings. Freed from the reign of sin, the soul is free to choose. Notice how necessary this action of grace is on the path of freeing the soul from the reign of sin. The goal of awakening grace and its power extricates man from the jaws of sin and places him on the point of indifference between good and evil. The scales of our will, on which the will leads toward one side or the other, should now be evenly weighted. But this cannot happen if the sinner is not given at least a foretaste of the sweetness of goodness. If this were not given, then the sweetness of sin, as we pointed out before, would attract him more strongly to itself than to goodness, and the choice would fall to the former, as happens with those who have contrived to change their lives without grace-filled awakening. For this is a general law, ignoti nulla cupido, that is, what you do not know you will not desire. But when grace-filled awakening allows him to taste the sweetness of goodness, it attracts him to itself, as we said, consciously and perceptively. The scales are even. Now complete freedom to act is in the person's hands. Everything is illumined by this grace-filled awakening. In this manner, as in a flash of lightning, everything within and around the person is illuminated by this grace-filled awakening. For one instant, it introduces the heart to the state from which sin has been cast out, and places man into the chain of creation from which he voluntarily exiled himself through sin. That is why this act of grace is always signified by a sudden fright and jolt, like the way the abrupt sound of the word "stop" jolts a person, walking quickly but lost in thought. If you look at this state from a psychological point of view, it is nothing other than an awakening of spirit. It is natural for our spirit to acknowledge divinity and the higher world or order of things, to raise man above everything sensual and carry him away to the purely spiritual realm. But in the sinful state, our spirit loses its strength and commingles with psychological emotionality, and through it with sensuality, to the point of practically disappearing into it. Now through grace it is extricated from this, and placed as if on a candlestand within our inner temple, and sheds its light upon everything dwelling within, and is visible from within. 12. Discerning states of awakening from natural states. That state in which the soul is placed during grace-filled awakening is similar to many natural states, with which it should not mix. The agonizing state of displeasure versus boredom. During a state of grace, a man finds himself in a certain agonizing, sorrowful state of displeasure within himself and his condition. But this is not the same as boredom. Note: this word in Russian, toska, actually has no direct translation. It is a combination of boredom and sad longing or emptiness, a sense of missing something to which we are attached. In boredom, there is no particular object. The man is afflicted and sad without knowing why or about what. To the contrary, in grace-filled awakening, there is a particular reason for his sorrow, namely having offended God and defiled himself. One is of the soul, while the other is of the spirit. One is tortuous, dark and murderous, which is why it is said, stifled by boredom. But the other enlivens and awakens. In our usual daily life, there are not a few of these vague boredoms, each one with its own shades. Worthy of particular note among them is yearning for one's heavenly homeland, the feeling of dissatisfaction with anything created, the feeling of spiritual peace. This is one of the natural movements of our spirit. When the passions begin little by little to quiet down, the spirit raises its own cry, distinctly calling out from the heart about its suffocating and humiliated condition in which it is held captive. It asks why it is not fed as it should be, but tormented with hunger. This is a longing for the heavenly fatherland, a sign with which the apostle heard in all creation. Nevertheless, it is not the same as grace-filled awakening. It is one of the natural movements or functions of our spirit, and in and of itself it is mute and fruitless. Grace-filled awakenings breathes upon it and communicates to it lightness and liveliness. Sorrow of spirit versus ordinary disappointment. With grace-filled awakening there is a sorrow of spirit, the sound of an alarm in the conscience. Nevertheless, this is entirely different from ordinary disappointment with ourselves for more or less serious blunders in our daily life. We lacerate ourselves when we say or do something wrong, and generally, in all occasions when we have, as they say, shamed ourselves, we even say, "Oh, how can I follow my conscience?" But this is not that voice of the Spirit's conscience that we now hear. In the first instance, the person is only thinking of himself and his temporary relationships. But in the other, to the contrary, the person forgets himself and everything temporary, and sees only God, whom he has offended, and his eternal relationship with him, which he has ruined. In the first instance, he stands for himself and human dictates, but in the second, he stands for God and his glory. In the first, he laments that he has shamed himself before people, while in the second, that he has shamed himself before God. He has nothing to do with people or even with the entire world. The first is a sorrow without consolation, but the second is mixed with a certain joy, for the first relies only on himself and others, and when that foundation is ruined, he has nowhere to turn. In the second, all support comes from God, by whom he longs not to be rejected, but he hopes in him. Our ordinary acts of conscience imitate the action of true conscience. You could say that it is also an act of conscience, only it is perverted, lowered from its original dignity. It has fallen together with the spirit from its essential height, from the spiritual realm, and landed in the realm of the emotional physical. It has begun to serve earthly goals, and has become, so to speak, a worldly conscience which feels its offense to man no more than its offense to God. Sensing life with God in eternal bliss versus bursts of exalted yearnings. During a grace-filled awakening, the heart is allowed to sense another, better, more perfect, joyous life. This, however, is not at all what people have who feel an awakening of bright impulses and noble yearnings, which we could call a movement of ideas. These manifestations correspond to that which is exalted over the ordinary order of things and tend toward the realization of grace-filled suggestion, but they diverge widely in direction and goals. The latter push one into some sort of foggy area, while the first turn one to God, show that peace that is in him, and grant a foretaste of it. The goal of the first is life with God in eternal bliss, and of the latter it is something. Of course, it is always something great and extraordinary, but nothing more can be said about it other than it is something. The supreme difference between them is that the latter sort of burst in and act uniquely. The Spirit inspires one person from one side and another person from another side, but the first embraces the entire Spirit on all sides, and placing it near the goal satisfies it, or gives it a foretaste of the total satisfaction to come. Bursts of exalted yearnings are essentially traces of God's image in man. It is a shattered image, and therefore it is discovered as resembling splintered and scattered rays. These rays must be gathered into one and concentrated, and this focus creates an igniting ray. This, shall we say, concentrated ray of spirit, unified within itself but broken up within the many-faceted soul, produces the grace that awakens the soul and ignites the spiritual life, not by setting the person into cold contemplation, but into a certain life-producing burning. Such a gathering of spirit corresponds to the feeling of divinity. This is embryonic life. It is the same in nature. Life does not appear until its powers act in a shattering way. But as soon as the higher powers collect into one, a living existence is manifest, as, for example, in a plant. So it is in the spirit. While the impulses are breaking things up, now this and now that, now in this direction and now in that direction, there is no life in it. When the higher divine power of grace concurrently descends upon the spirit, it brings all of its strivings into one and holds them in this unity. Then comes the fire of spiritual life. By these signs, it is easy to distinguish grace-filled awakening from ordinary manifestations of spiritual life, in order that they not be confused, and mainly in order not to miss the chance to make use of them for salvation. It is particularly necessary to know this regarding those times when the grace of God acts without any preliminary effort on the person's part, or without any particular strength. The awakened state cannot go by unnoticed, but it is possible to not give it the attention it deserves, and, having been some time in it, again to fall into the ordinary circular motion of soul and body. Awakening does not complete the work of the sinner's conversion, but only initiates it. The work on himself lies ahead, and it is very complicated work at that. Everything, by the way, related to this is completed in two turning points. First in the movement toward oneself, and then away from oneself to God. By the first movement, the person regains the authority he had lost over himself, and the second brings him forth as a sacrifice to God, a whole burnt offering of freedom. In the first movement, he comes to the decision to abandon sin, and in the second, drawing nearer to God, he gives a promise to belong to Him alone throughout the days of his life.